Hello everyone, welcome to From Nowhere to Nothing, Ontological Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a doctoral student in psychology, and with me today is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of English and philosophy. If there's a topic you'd like us to cover on the show, feel free to email us at fromnowheretonothingpodcast@gmail.com or contact us on our Facebook page. Following the Enlightenment and the advent of scientific rationalism, the world began changing rapidly, spurred by technological and socio-political developments. When learning about these events in your history classes, they were likely portrayed in broad positive strokes, presented as setting the foundations for the monumental feats of modernity. As expected, this simplistic historicity doesn't fully describe the events of the past half-millennium. And much as the Golden Age of Greece drew cynicism from Diogenes, questionable aspects of modern thought and institutions have been subject to the scrutinization and reinterpretation of the postmodern movement. So, we've been making, I guess sort of coincidentally, we've been talking about a lot of these concepts in recent weeks, sort of, not directly, but making allusions to postmodern sort of concepts in some ways. So you and I were talking about it. We said we should probably do a whole episode on it. Because it's a very complex topic and people have very strong feelings about it.
But, yes, especially in the academic world.
Yeah. So what is postmodernism?
Well, let's start with modernism, just as you know, and if what I am about to say seems in any way talking down, it is not intended that way but I've encountered students who don't know what the prefix post means. So postmodernism is after modernism. So modernism, which primarily was a literary, artistic movement in the 20th century, the early 20th century, began that way as experimentation, as pushing the boundaries of the traditional formalistic rules to see what could be done and begin to question the notion of what reality can look like. And so then you had offshoots of things like Fauvism, which was using colors that had nothing to do with representational art to suggest a mood or a way of seeing a person or a situation. And Cubism, which was trying to to reconceptualize figures and any proper noun, buildings, whatever, as geometric forms, and see what that told us about the form itself. And that was very interesting. And then modernism got suffused with, or picked up by, or messed around with by political and military industrial complex kinds of not interferences, but co-opting. So modernism more generally was having the newest thing now, whatever the newest technology was, whatever the newest, if you had a black and white TV, but there was a color TV, you wanted to get it. So modernism was being up on things, of current state of the art, whatever the tools happen to be. But modernism was still going on in art. But then, and in literary thought, in modernism, there were all kinds of critical theories that were developed about how to read a text and how to see a text. And so some students now even will go through school and they're saying, well, let's look at it through this lens, or let's look at it in such and such a way. So there was reader response theory, which was that of how you take a piece of work is really the primary importance, not the piece of work itself. And then postmodernism began to take place, which came through primarily literary theory and philosophy, that was trying to take apart the structure of meaning and look at what meaning itself meant. And some of it went so far as to try to deconstruct. It was called deconstructionism, to the point where you couldn't trust language at all. Nothing had any meaning. And so, there were some people embracing this. But now it's become suffused into our culture in such a way that we talk about, well, there is no truth. There is no meaning, or this has so many meanings, it can mean anything. And so it becomes reductivist. And that's very brief, but that's sort of the tenor of things. There are really a number of French philosophers, Jean Lyotard and Roland Barthes and
Foucault,
Derrida, Jacques Derrida. These names are not happily whispered from my mouth sometimes. But that's a start.
Yeah, I think that's a really good background, because you've done a good job of demonstrating the various disciplines that were affected, and the ways in which they were affected, right? Because postmodernism, as this sort of a blanket or umbrella term, doesn't necessarily have the same impact across different disciplines, right? Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think that the thing that jumps out to me immediately, right, is that no movement should have ever, with the exception of the one, no movement should ever be called modernism, right? Because that's going to be always changing. So the only one that could really count was the keeping up with the Joneses that you mentioned, where you're always looking for the cutting edge thing. But other than that, it's sort of describing a specific art movement or something that has a static association with a certain time period as modernism. Now you have postmodernism, and now you have postmodernism, right?
And how far do you go when you write a letter? I mean, I laugh sometimes about this, because back when we were writing letters, and some of us still do once in a while, right? You'd finish a letter and say, "Sincerely, me." And I have one more thought. P.S. That's postscript. That means after the script, after what you've written. I have another thought. But then P.P.S., which is postscript. And people actually got to 3 or 4, and then it just gets goofy.
Right?
So there's a sense of humor involved in that when you're writing letters. It's not necessarily extant in the philosophizing.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that was good background. Why don't you tell us, how did the movement start, and who were its founders? So we talked briefly about some of them.
Yeah, well, Foucault. Let's. I'm not going to take. There's no need to be really chronological, because more or less they were all operating within a 30-ish year period at the start. But Foucault, we've talked about before, who had the intent of having us reimagine or rethink things that we just took as standard. So Foucault was, for instance, trying to reconceive what the idea of prison was about, and how prisons could be built, and what are we trying to accomplish with prisons. And he wrote a number of pieces that put traditionalists off, but also were worth a read. He was across many different fields, but just as in the idea of prison, he was talking about the panopticon, which is essentially a prison where you have one guard, because the whole thing is designed so that there's one person in a central space who can watch everything and press the buttons and lock the doors and whatever if things go on, and to try to get prisoners to police themselves, so to speak, in some ways. And it wasn't a completely, we ought to make all prisons like this, but it was a, what are we doing in prisons kind of approach. Why are we doing what we're doing? We need to rethink. And I'm with him on that. I don't agree with everything that no one does ever with any philosopher, but I think it was fresh to me, because he was writing at a time when I was young and was in undergraduate and then graduate work and encountering his books.
Yeah, I remember you mentioned the panopticon in one of my early classes when I was getting a criminal justice degree, so I was really interested in it. And I think the way that I sort of conceptualize it today is it was kind of like it was a piece of concept art, kind of, right?
Interesting, yeah.
Yeah, where you go, this is a vision of what the future could be like, even if all the details and all of the things are a little bit stylized or a little bit out there. I think that's sort of the purpose of concept pieces, right, isn't to accurately represent what the future will be like, but to just get you thinking about how it could be different.
Yes, yeah, I like that. I like that. I like your conceptualization of it that way. One of my favorite things that he wrote: people know what they do. Frequently, they know why they do what they do, but what they don't know is what they do does. So, in other words, we're not very good at thinking about the ramifications of what it is that we do. We know what we have done in terms of a specific act. You know, classroom teachers evaluate all the time. How did something go post class? Right, the post game, going back over the view of the football game and looking at the movie. We used to have to do that in graduate school for practice teaching. It was horrific to sit and watch yourself on a videotape, an entire class, and you say, "Oh, I didn't know I did that with chalk. Oh, I didn't know I did that with paper clips. I have a totally distractive." But you learn from it, right? All right. Frequently, they know why they do what they do. Okay, but we don't know where that goes. We don't necessarily think about what that has led to. And it's really hard to see that in teaching, because sometimes you can see an immediate effect, but sometimes you don't hear for years, if ever, how a life went and whatever effect you might have had on that life. And that's, I think, true for people who are in EMTs and rescue people who are in the military and in live action, or not even in, you encountered all kinds of people with all kinds of personalities. And I would guess that you probably don't know what happened to all of them, maybe some of them. And so there's a truth in that. We aren't we're not omniscient. We're not anything. The sum total of whatever it is. And so he says it's not necessary to know what I am. The main interest in life and work is to become someone else that I was not in the beginning. That's really what underlies a lot of the earliest postmodernism, which then becomes almost a cynical game. It becomes gamified, and then that really doesn't sit well with me.
Yeah, and we're going to get into some of this, but I think that it's important, right, before we start just pointing out the flaws in postmodernism, to point out the beneficial aspects of thinking about things differently, right? Which is where it started. And so that short quote by Foucault really captures that, right? Because I think that anybody who, metacognitively reflects on their own processing in the world can find some truth in it, right? Yeah, I know what I'm doing. And most of the time I know why I'm doing it, but sometimes I don't even know that. But really, once you get to that last part, like you mentioned, we all have moments where we're interacting with people all the time, and often we never stop to think about how it influenced somebody. I shared a story with you a while back about somebody who reached out to me to let me know that, over 10 years before, I had defended them in a sexual harassment situation, and that it had changed their life and they never forgot about it. And I didn't even remember it. And you go, this is something that didn't mean anything to me, because to me, there was no power. There's no power struggle. There's no power hierarchy. There was no systemic issues that I personally had any stake in. But for this individual, there was an imbalance of power. There was, a systemic problem, and to be interacted with in the way that they felt threatened and helpless, and to have somebody step in and on their behalf was very meaningful, right? So that last part is
it resonates. It resonates, and I think add it, as you say, to start out with just what it's about. Jean Lyotard was operating from the principle that none of us have ultimate meaning. We don't have the absolute truth. And he says we really ought to not make claims on being original, the things that we say, or the things that we say are even true. But we shouldn't be trying to be predictive with the things that we say and do. Now, this is interesting given what we were talking about before the show about AI and so on, but rather strategic. What do we do in our own work, whatever that is, or our own life path, whatever that is, rather than trying to predict what comes next and what comes next and what comes next? Can we embrace the idea that we don't know everything? Can we embrace the idea that our vision of truth is necessarily limited? And can we embrace the idea that we aren't even often original, in the sense that we borrow from many, many other influences? You asked me about a piece of art before we came up, because I had the audacity to do a calendar and hand out to my friends of pieces of art over the years, over the past year. That was arrogant, but it's been received well. But that piece of art, what you saw for the month of May on that particular piece, and what I intended weren't completely at opposite ends of the scale. But when I said a few words, that changed how you saw some things. That's the power of language. That doesn't mean that what you see should be totally limited to what I say is there. But that should be part of the equation. And so when the intent of postmodernism is to question the nature of absolute truth, or to and to question the limitations of our own perception, and try to get us to say, well, okay, but how does that sit with other versions all around us? That invites conversation, analysis, involvement, and integration. But that's not where it ends up going, but that's where it starts.
Yeah. And that's really good. So in the intro, I was talking about Diogenes, right? What differentiates postmodernism from skepticism or cynicism more broadly?
Well, I'm going to say this, and you can slap my patty. Not much now.
Yeah.
But at the beginning, the skepticism was, I think, not intended in a virulent, mean-spirited, or vicious or obfuscatory way, but it was. But Diogenes was pretty much, according to the stories, which are stories. Mm-hmm. It's a narrative. We don't know Diogenes. We don't know much about the man who lived in the doghouse, so to speak, or the amphora or whatever he was in, and came out and barked at people and yelled at them. And now some of the post-structuralists end up doing that. Some, like Derrida, when you take a position that maybe 5 people in the world understand Derrida, and Derrida says even Derrida does not understand Derrida, then you've got to look at it and say, then what is the point?
It sounds an awful lot like nonsense.
Yeah. But that's not what Diogenes was doing. So I think he wasn't necessarily calling meaning into question as a first principle. He was calling social interaction and social rules into question. There's an interaction with much later postmodernism, but it's not the same thing.
Yeah, I think the crux of the conversation, right, and really the problem, and then it's not a problem necessarily of postmodernism versus, the scientific institution, so much as it is the problem of epistemology. Period. Right? Is this idea of how do we come to know things, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we talk on the show all the time. The name of our show is From Nowhere to Nothing, right? And so we spend an hour here each week taking a concept and trying to know something about it.
Yeah.
And very often we come up with the answer, well, we've gotten somewhere, but we still don't know. And so that's science is cool with that, right? The sort of epistemology is okay with that. All right, we're making progress. We have tools at our disposal. They're limited, but they can provide us some insight. But the world is a big, complex place, and so as a result, coming to a firm view of facts that are unchanging, right, that aren't going to be invalidated or replaced or modified with future endeavors into the fields. That's a very hard thing to come by.
Yeah.
Postmodernism essentially says, at face value, it might look like it's saying something similar, right? Well, you can't really know anything. But it's also sort of saying the reason you can't know anything is because you can't really make any progress, because the ability of there to be an aggregation of agreed upon knowledge and progress is impossible due to power imbalances, right? Meta-narratives,
which by their very nature are going to be flawed, incomplete, not able to embrace everything. And when they are asserted as an absolute truth, then we get lots of difficulties. And so there is a use in the post-structural intent, for Lyotard, for example, to say, all right, look, we had a rationalist period, and then we moved into a post-rational period. I think that would be fair to say about our own time, meaning that we don't recognize the value of rationality so much as we recognize or privilege how we feel about things. Very seldom do people say comparatively, I think this or I think that. No, I feel this or I feel that. And they may somehow obscure those two terms, but they are not the same terms. And post-structuralism will say, all right, so here we have an idea of what knowledge might be, or we seek knowledge. But because of the technological computer age, that is reduced to information. And the nature of information is data and data points. And that becomes, this is a big web, but that becomes a capitalistic or monetized or, capitalized process. So that knowledge just becomes information, and information may not be accurate, and people call information into question all the time. So if my information is not accurate because you don't accept it as accurate, then my coin is not nearly as valuable as the coin you share with your tribe, which agrees with what you believe. And so knowledge is left at the wayside, and a kind of quasi-mysticism and amplification of feeling over everything removes the possibility of some kinds of knowledge.
Yeah, I think that's a really good analogy. I like that a lot, because it can be difficult to talk about this sometimes but it has far-ranging implications, right? What postmodernism is saying versus empiricism and rationalism, they lead you into two wildly different realms. But when you're looking at some of these sort of nuanced things, you can find yourself, if you're not being rational, going, oh, okay, yeah, no, that sounds good, right? But it's sort of like, if you think of information as currency, well, there's all kinds of currencies in the world, and maybe there's no exchange rate, and so therefore, what do I even mean? Well, they have to be backed by knowledge, right? That's sort of like having gold backing a dollar.
Or backed by a meta-narrative that sells faster than another meta-narrative. A structured ideological view of the world. And if that gets popularized, then it's hard for knowledge to hold sway. These are language games, and games not in the sense of in a negative sense, but just in a sense of as a structure. Scientific approaches work with denotation, the attempt to be objective, the attempt to have neutral response to words. Deconstruction goes way beyond that and says, all right, I'm going to dismantle the word entirely. We know that words have more than one meaning. We know that we can take words in entirely different ways and it's the same word. So let's just get out with it and say, and I'm not doing all of deconstruction because I can't, because I don't understand it all myself. I've studied, but but essentially you reduce, you smash meaning into the particulate matter. And as we've talked about with particles before, if you reduce things to its utter essence and there's no coherence, what are you left with? You're left with particulate matter. And what does that say to you? Well, nothing. So if I can't find meaning in language, if I call language into question all the time, and I call authorial intent into language all the time, and I call any what's the word I want? Anybody who has knowledge and training and background, if I call their authority into question, then I've totally relativized the process of communication. And if I relativize the process of communication, then all kinds of messes can happen.
Yeah. I mean, we've talked about, we've used water as an example before, right? If you look at H2O, well, hydrogen and oxygen they don't have the properties of wetness, the two molecules. You put them together and all of a sudden you have something that's wet. But to deny that water is wet at all, right? Because hydrogen and oxygen aren't wet. So it's just something that is constructed, right? It strips the reality of the situation of its meaning or its intent.
Yes. And postmodernism I'd say that at its best says, look, we've radically shifted. We don't care about the ends of our actions. And that's back to something Foucault says. We care about the means. We don't care about the ends of what we know. We care about what are the tools we use to come to know them. And so we get caught up with our tools and not thinking about, but what are we actually doing with these things? And there is a postmodern, strong, increasingly strong, I think, pushback from not just from young people, but I think it has certainly emerged from younger people as things are wont to do. To say, look, I'm tired of being caught up in social media all the time, being knocked around like a piece of flotsam, and what everyone says, determining my mental health and maybe even my existence, all because of what's on that screen. Just close the screen, turn it off. How's that? Now I'm not hearing all those things everybody else is saying. How does that affect me? And so in some ways, postmodernism takes one back to thinking about why are we using the tools the way we're using, and maybe we shouldn't be using those tools quite as much.
Yeah. Do you want to talk a little bit more about meta-narratives and kind of power structures as kind of something that frames postmodern discussions?
I will try to do it in a denotative way. We tell stories. We know that. Sometimes the stories get so large that they are supposed to govern how it is we view the world. We are trained into a story of how the world works. That's a meta-narrative in which all the other stories ultimately lead to the giant story. Nationalism leads us to that. Okay. And so we hear a story replicated over and over and over again about a historical figure. And until someone comes along and says, that really never happened, none of the documentation shows us that happened, then you're having somebody come along and challenge the meta-narrative. And that sets all the bees buzzing, so to speak. That's, people are, they're attacking our way of life. They're attacking our. No, we're saying that what you think you know isn't so. And if you consider then the knowledge that is new to you and try to integrate that into what you know, it might change your view, and therefore it might change how you act, and therefore it might change what you do. And that might change the entire story of that particular culture. So meta means including all of the culture and the story being told, but then people looking away from the story saying, oh, this is how the story is working. So people who are in meta-narrative and not realizing that they're in one think that they're just part of the story. They don't see themselves as so-called breaking the fourth wall and stepping outside and looking back in. We know that TV characters do this. We see this happen on stage sometimes. Someone comments about somebody else is there, and that's kind of a meta narrative. Meta writing is one in which you write, let's say you write a paragraph in an essay, and then you step back and you say, all right, well, I was writing this because this is what I was thinking at the time. It's the way the writing instructors sometimes use to say, well, why were you saying what you were saying? So rather than just accepting what you're saying and going on, you back out and you examine it. And meta-narrative is a giant story, but talking about the meta-narrative, even while you're being part of that story, is the way that things are gamified and the way things can therefore be changed. You stop and you say, do we all believe that everyone is equal? We say we do. The whole story has told us, well, yeah, but not everyone. But that's okay because we're great. Oh, but could we be greater? Might we, what are those rules that we set up at the beginning that say about us, and where have we failed? We haven't failed. We're this great culture. We don't fail. Well, but of course we do. And if we don't even admit that we've had failures, then how are we going to get better? And that's how meta-narrative works. For any nation, for any group of people. Okay.
Yeah. And so that was a really great explanation. And it highlights, what theoretically postmodernism can do in a positive way, right? Which is to come in and sort of be the mirror for society, right? To come in and say, hey, listen, we all act as if we're all playing by these rules, but nobody's ever stopped to say whether the rules are fair or whether the game makes sense or any of these things. So let's step outside of the narrative and look back and see who has the power, right? What does language mean? How does all of this go together? And then in a perfect world, right, that leads to self-reflection and reconceptualization of how society should work. Where things can go off the rails is when, rather than establishing a new meta-narrative, rather than conceptualizing what we have as shared knowledge and how we all experience the world, instead defaulting to self-referentiality, right? And saying, well, what the world means to me is completely separate from what the world means to you.
And losing ourselves in ephemeral pursuits, meaning swiping through reels. Oh, well, that's funny. Oh, that's sad. Oh, there's somebody being blown up. Oh, there's a funny, cute dog. Oh, And doing that until we realize, oh, wasn't I reading a novel? How did I get into this? And so the postmodernism can also be a referential of the wholly fragmented, ephemeral, no piece connecting to any other in our experiences of social media, or even our experiences when people start talking about, well, we don't have community anymore. What are they really saying? Some people mean I'm by myself because nobody believes the things that I believe. Well, but of course somebody does, and you seek those people out. Some people are very good at surrounding themselves with people who preach to the choir, and they're all together, but they never listen to somebody else. And so it's like a conglomerate of fragmentation because it's still only one view going la la la, bubbling around here in the froth, the quantum froth, in a way. And so there's perceivably a lack of depth, a lack of thinking something through that is exacerbated by some of our uses of our own technology. But ultimately, it's about us just acceding to that, giving ourselves up to it and saying, oh, well, Yeah,
it's a collapse of contextualization in a lot of ways. And I had my first experience with this actually in my last class. I was taking advanced qualitative research methods. And, the textbook went through and it laid out, categories of inquiry, going from the most traditional to the most radical, and then laying out different ways of approaching things. And, they encourage you to pick, from these groups, what your approach would be. And then throughout the semester, you wrote sections of your final paper and would submit them for review. And then at the end, you kind of piece it all together. And some of the feedback that I got, which was interesting to me, right? It was because you'd always been trained throughout my whole educational career, right? That you wanted to be as objective as possible, right? You're trying to discover the truth. And some of the feedback that I got doing a qualitative assignment was, you sort of, you need to remove that objective God's eye view from your writing. They said you need to insert yourself into the paper and identify your own biases and what you think about the concept that you're studying and how that's affected your method of inquiry. And you need to make that known to the reader, right? And that was sort of jarring to me in some ways. And it's one of those things where I had mixed feelings about it, because depending on where you land on the scale of how you view academic writing, right, from the most traditional categories that they represented up to the postmodernist critical theories that were very radical and very personalized and sort of eschewing the outside academia. I could see the positive benefits of it, right? I could see, yes, academic writing does need this, right? Because if you just talk from an objective viewpoint, you never say I, you never say we, you never present yourself to the reader.
In social sciences particularly.
Yeah. Then the reader is more inclined to take what you're writing as the God's honest truth. And they don't know who you are, and they don't have insight to your background, your biases, and all of the things that make you tick, right? And we're all humans and we all have these things. So whenever we're approaching a topic, we bring things to it that shape our views. And then despite our best efforts, it will shape the way that we research and write about things. And so that's important, right? And that's at its best, I think that's what postmodernism is supposed to do. But at its worst, right, when I'm looking at these most radical theories, right, that are saying, and I was, in the textbook reading about them saying, basically, you're throwing everything that's ever been established in academia out the window, and you're starting from scratch, and you're going to inductively build your view of what this concept means for you, and then you're going to present it to people. I go, well, that's just an opinion piece. Like you can be rigorous, I guess, in the way that you approach it, but your rigor is still self-referential. You're not building upon the knowledge that came before you.
Yeah.
So how are the core tenets of philosophical thought, such as ontology and epistemology, affected by postmodern viewpoints?
Well, you just go with the one that you just said. If you choose not to believe anything that anyone who has academic authority is asserting, and you go entirely by yourself, then from an epistemic viewpoint, from the viewpoint of how we construct knowledge, you're saying my knowledge is the only knowledge that is important. But where does your knowledge come from? Well, it comes from what my mom told me, or what my grandma said, or folk knowledge, let's say. All right. And what did they study? They studied life because they lived it. Okay, and so experientially, they have some things to offer you. If they told you that in order to cure a stomachache, you really needed to have 3 glasses of bourbon, would you do it? Yes, because they told me. So I just, let's follow this through. All right. So do you know that if you have 3 glasses of bourbon a day, it's probably going to have a deleterious effect on your health? Not necessarily. There are people who live into their 90s and they say they smoke cigars all the time. And then, but there's no logic there. You're talking about 2 different models, 2 different conditions, but you don't understand logic necessarily because you haven't formally given some thought to it. Doesn't mean you have to go to college to study it, but you have to think about the very things that you're saying and call them into question. That's the upside of the postmodern. But so there's the epistemic. Okay, if you follow your own provenance, the trail of where you think your knowledge is coming from, or unless you just think you're a prophet and all the knowledge is being given to you by a god, and therefore it's real because I was told this. Okay, so I have no seal of approval on that because there's no way for me to test that, to know that, and I would just have to take your word for it. But that's certainly not going to guide my decision-making in any large measure because I have no background for it. The epistemology, ontology, being, how we actually are in the world. If you move through the world and you say that the only thing that is true is what I say is true, how far are you going to move through the world? What is the condition of your movement within the world? Those are the questions I would ask.
Yeah, and I think that it brings me to the next question, which is the postmodern paradigm a self-defeating one, right? Because what you've sort of described in the way that you've addressed epistemology and ontology is the view of sophism, essentially, right? This sort of view that what exists to me is the truth and what exists to anybody else really doesn't exist, right? There's a lot of problems with that. Well, and there's really one big one, right? Which is, I remember I've got 2 pretty good, they're not quotes because I don't remember the exact language, but 2 pretty good examples, right? One was a lady who said that, she was a sophist and she couldn't understand why nobody else was. And the other one was, and this is a very prevalent critique of postmodernism, right? And I can't remember who said it, but he basically said, if you postmodernism is built on the fact that rationalization and argument is invalid, then it's already invalidated itself because it's attempting to rationalize and argue against rationalization and argumentation. So it's using the very tools that it's trying to tear apart in order to support itself.
Yeah, that's where it collapses for me. But that's an extreme, right? And so I go back to Lyotard, who said he did a nice little 1 paragraph. To be postmodern is to have to approach meta-narratives with incredulity. Not with ultimate skepticism to say, nope, I'm not even going to believe it before I start. But incredulity, which is to say, there may be a lot of incredible elements to this, incredible being not necessarily believable or past the normal stage of acceptance of that doesn't mean you don't accept it. It means you investigate it.
Yeah.
In fact, it requires you to be actively involved with investigating, but not investigating by finding things on the internet that sound like you want them to sound. But this is where it comes back to the academic. If you're really well taught, you approach research and you allow yourself to be surprised and make a 180-degree turn sometimes, or various degrees, when you encounter that which seems authoritative and is backed up by other authorities and double tested and triple tested. And okay, if that is so, then how do I alter my view?
Yeah. And I think that that's really good. It leads into the last question really well, which is, what the role postmodern thought should play in philosophical investigation, right? And I think that for me, with the conversation that we've had and the interactions I've had with it in academia and in my own studies and things is, well, we did an episode on skepticism. We did an episode on cynicism. And yeah, I think if you can't differentiate between those two, you can fall prey to postmodernism, right? And I think that being able to differentiate those two is very close to what you were just talking about, right? Because when we did those episodes and we examined the differences, what each one of them meant and what the differences between them were, what we discovered was that skepticism can be a very healthy thing. It can also not be a healthy thing, but it has the potential to be good. Cynicism really doesn't have that upside as much, right? And so, that's that fine line, right? When we're talking about epistemology, how do we come to know things, right? And how do we come to view authority on topics? How do we determine what those sources are? Without skepticism, you're likely to fall prey to false meta-narratives. But with cynicism, you're likely to throw out the baby with the bathwater.
You throw out all meta-narratives without finding any shred of usefulness or applicability or utility in them. Yeah, you said that well. I think that we forget the best part of science, which is not that it's perfect, but that it fully well realizes, as we've said many times in many ways in our podcast, the best scientists are those who, when they have developed a structured approach, a theoretical approach to something, which is not a guess, which is not a hypothesis, which is not a one-off toss-out idea. It is a structured approach to how something may work. They are the first people who try to prove themselves wrong before somebody else does. And I think that, to me, is the ultimate test. Do we question our own thoughts at all? Do we question our own positions in any way at all? Or do we just uniformly accept that, well, we must be right because we thought it?
Yeah.
And so postmodernism, Harold Pinter, the playwright, said that truth and falsehood, something can be true and false at the same time. That's nothing new, but here's a playwright saying, okay, and building into some of his work, we question the truth of something in order to try to find the truth of something. But cynicism doesn't. Cynicism just says there's no truth. So you can't trust anybody to tell you anything.
And, by necessity, what that means is that nobody should trust you to tell them that nothing exists.
And so we're back to what you said before. Yes.
Yeah. So, I think that it was good because, we, again, at its best, right, it causes us to have skepticism, right? And to to call into question the things that we've taken for granted and the things that we've been told. Because like I was mentioning, with scientific writing, right? Scientists are humans. Scientists have biases, and those biases will inevitably, despite their best efforts, work their way into how they investigate things, into how they write and report things.
Yes.
But that being said, scientific training does its best to make scientists aware of that and to, account for it as best they can. And then after the fact, peer review and institutional and, academic culture examines the writing and the works of other people before it can be disseminated to the public. And so the process is attempting as best it can to have some objective integrity, right? And so
and humility.
Yeah. And so when we're thinking about how we come to know things and what the proper amount and direction of skepticism is towards authoritative knowledge sources, it's good. It's good to question, right? It's good to look at things with incredulity. But
it is. Samuel Beckett, also a playwright, a one-liner that is so. It teaches humility. And I think we all would recognize this, whether it's a song lyric or something from a show we've heard or something that somebody has said. I know I heard this. It was right, and he said, "What is that unforgettable line?" Which means it wasn't so unforgettable that I retained it. Well, if I couldn't retain that unforgettable line, maybe there are other things that aren't quite the way I thought.
Yeah. Exactly. I think that's a good line to end on. So until next time, keep pondering.